Beneath the glittering crowns and magnificent palaces of Europe's most powerful dynasty flowed a secret river of blood, a hidden inheritance far more potent than any jewel or throne. This is not the story you think you know of the Romanovs, of revolution and icy cellars. This is the story of a curse, a silent, creeping doom that wove itself through the gilded halls of the Romanovs, a biological specter haunting their lineage. It is a tale of a love that became a prison, of a secret so devastating it was locked away in royal bedchambers and whispered about by terrified physicians. The hemophilia that stalked the last Tsarevich was not a random twist of fate. It was the bitter harvest of generations of strategic marriages, a deadly secret born from the belief that royal blood must only mix with royal blood. Subscribe to History 1 as we pull back the velvet curtain on one of history's most tragic and closely guarded secrets. The air in the grand reception room of the Winter Palace was thick with the scent of beeswax and fear. It was the autumn of 1904, and a hushed, desperate energy had replaced the usual imperial pomp. Tsar Nicholas II, his face a mask of weary anxiety, paced before a gilded fireplace. In an adjoining bedroom, his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, knelt by a sumptuous crib, her prayers a frantic silent whisper. Their son, the long-awaited heir, Alexei Nikolaevich, was just a few weeks old. The joyous announcements had been sent across the empires of Europe. Cannons had fired in salute, yet there were no public celebrations. A shadow had fallen over the house of Romanov almost from the moment of the boy's birth. The family's trusted physician, Dr. Eugene Botkin, emerged from the nursery, his expression grave. He carried a small silver bowl containing a cloth. He placed it before the Tsar. On the white linen, like a grotesque sprinkling of rare rubies, were tiny, perfect drops of blood. "Your Imperial Majesty," Botkin's voice was low, strained. "The bleeding from the navel, it has resumed. It is slow, but it refuses to clot. We have applied every known agent, pressure, ice, powdered alum. The effect is minimal." Nicholas stared at the blood, a cold dread gripping his heart. How can this be? A simple scratch, a common occurrence for any infant. Botkin hesitated, choosing his words with the care of a man navigating a political minefield. "It is not a simple matter, sire. The bleeding is persistent. It suggests a fragility of the vessels, a constitutional weakness." He could not bring himself to say the word. Not yet. To name it was to make it real, to seal a terrible fate. But Alexandra knew. She had emerged from the nursery, her beautiful face etched with a terror that was more than maternal concern. It was the stark, recognizing terror of a prophecy fulfilled. She had seen this specter before, in the distant corridors of her own childhood. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe, a title that had come to sound like a cruel joke. For Victoria had passed on something far more significant than her crown jewels to her descendants, a hidden flaw, a curse carried silently in the X chromosome of her royal blood. "It is the English disease," Alexandra whispered, her voice trembling. She never called it by its medical name, hemophilia. To her, it was a spiritual affliction, a cross sent by God for her to bear. She believed her deep faith, her connection to the mystic Rasputin, was the only thing that could shield her son. But Nicholas, a man of simpler, more straightforward faith, saw the raw, physical truth. His son, the future Tsar of all the Russias, was fragile as glass. A fall from a toy horse, a bumped knee, a loose tooth, any of the normal scrapes of boyhood could become a torturous, days-long ordeal of internal bleeding, swelling joints, and agonizing pain. How could such a boy rule the vast, turbulent Russian Empire? The secret became the central, unspoken fact of their lives. Alexei's condition was a state secret more closely guarded than any military plan. The public was told the Tsarevich suffered from anemia or a nervous disposition. Only the innermost circle of the family and a few terrified servants knew the truth. The boy was surrounded by a cocoon of desperate protection. Two burly sailors from the Imperial Navy, Derevenko and Nagorny, were assigned as his dedicated diadki, his nannies. Their duty was not to play with him, but to shadow his every step, to catch him before he could fall, to become, in essence, human shields against his own body. Yet, the question hung in the opulent air, a ghost at the feast. Why? Why had this scourge visited the Romanovs? They traced their line back to the formidable Michael Romanov, chosen by the Zemsky Sobor in 1613. There was no history of this bleeding sickness in their direct ancestry. The answer, of course, lay not in the Romanov blood, but in the blood that had been introduced into it. It lay in the intricate, incestuous web of European royal marriages, a practice designed to consolidate power, but which had, instead, cultivated a deadly genetic harvest. The curse did not originate in the snows of Russia, but in the carefully manicured courts of Germany and England. It was the price of keeping the bloodlines pure, a deadly secret woven into the very fabric of the dynasty's pride. The origin of the Romanovs' tragedy was not, as many believed, a sudden bolt from the blue. It was a slow, creeping poison introduced into the dynasty's bloodstream generations before Alexei's first cry. To understand it, one must travel back to the early 19th century, to the reign of Tsar Nicholas III, a man so obsessed with order, discipline, and the unassailable power of the monarchy that he would unwittingly set the stage for its eventual collapse. Nicholas I viewed Europe as a family affair, but a family where power was the only currency that mattered. The Romanovs were relative newcomers on this stage compared to the ancient houses of Habsburg and Bourbon. To cement their place, they began a systematic campaign of marital diplomacy. His children, and his children's children, were not merely sons and daughters. They were pawns on a grand chessboard, their marriages strategic moves designed to create alliances, secure borders, and amplify Romanov prestige. It was his son, Tsar Alexander II, who continued this tradition with vigor. He saw a Germany, then a collection of duchies and principalities, as a fertile hunting ground for aristocratic brides. The German states were rich in royalty, but often poor in land and power, making them eager to marry their princesses into the vast wealth of the Russian Empire. These unions were seen as perfect matches. They brought the Romanovs' connections to the heart of Europe without the threat of a competing superpower. But this strategy had a fatal, unseen flaw. The small, intermarried royal houses of Germany were a petri dish for recessive genetic traits. For generations, they had married amongst themselves, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, concentrating their gene pool in a way that would horrify modern scientists. They believed they were preserving their blue blood, a substance they considered somehow different, more refined than that of commoners. In reality, they were simply stacking the deck against their own descendants. The key union, the one that would carry the poison directly into the heart of the Romanov line, was that of Alexander II's son, the future Alexander III, to a Danish princess, Dagmar. This, in itself, was safe. The danger came from their son, Nicholas II. When the time came for the young Tsarevich to marry, his eyes fell upon Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine. She was a striking beauty, with delicate features and a serene, almost ethereal demeanor that captivated him. But she was also a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. The court of St. Petersburg was aghast. Alex was from a minor German duchy, and worse, her mother had died of diphtheria when she was young, leaving her somewhat withdrawn and prone to melancholy. The Russian aristocracy sneered at this minor princess, but they did not know the true danger she carried within her. Queen Victoria, by the time of Alex's birth, was a matriarch whose bloodline was a ticking time bomb. The queen herself was likely a spontaneous mutation, the first in her line to carry the hemophilia gene. From her, it spread like a virus through the royal houses of Europe, passed silently from mother to son, or from mother to daughter, who would then become a carrier. Alex's own brother, Friedrich, had been a bleeder. He had died in childhood after a fall. His short life, a torment of bruises and internal hemorrhages. Alex knew the shadow this cast. She had seen her mother, Princess Alice, worn down by the constant, frantic care of her brother. When Nicholas proposed, she initially refused, not out of a lack of love, but out of a deep-seated fear of the Orthodox conversion required. She was a devout Lutheran, but Nicholas, deeply in love, was persistent. He saw her refusal as piety, not premonition. He never asked about the health of her male relatives. It was not a question one asked in polite royal circles. The secret of the English disease was a family shame, whispered about but never formally acknowledged. So, Alex of Hesse, rebaptized as the Orthodox Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, arrived in Russia, carrying not only her hopes for a new life, but also the genetic curse of her grandmother. When she gave birth to 4 healthy daughters in succession, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, there was relief, but also a gnawing anxiety. The throne demanded a male heir. And when, at last, Alexei was born, the secret that had crossed the English Channel and traveled from the Hessian court to the Winter Palace finally revealed itself. The strategic marital web, woven over decades to strengthen the Romanovs, had instead delivered their greatest weakness directly into the nursery. The news, when it was finally confirmed by the most esteemed physicians of the empire, was a death sentence not for the boy, but for the dynasty itself. The diagnosis was unequivocal: hemophilia. The word was spoken in hushed, horrified tones within the palace's private chambers, but never beyond its walls. For Tsar Nicholas, a man who embodied the very principle of autocracy, the frailty of his heir was an unspeakable contradiction. How could the absolute ruler of 1/6 of the world's landmass, the little father to his people, be powerless against the biology of his own son? Alexei's childhood became a study in controlled terror. His world was a gilded cage, padded with privilege and fear. The sprawling parks of Tsarskoye Selo were his kingdom, but he could never run freely through them. The grand staircases of the Alexander Palace were treacherous mountains to be navigated with care. His dedicated sailors, Derivenko and Nagorny, were his constant shadows. To an outside observer, it might have looked like the ultimate indulgence, a child so precious he had human guardians for his every step. But the truth was a grim, daily routine of prevention. They would carry him, place him gently in chairs, and watch with hawk-like intensity for any sign of a stumble. The episodes of bleeding were not mere incidents. They were cataclysms. A seemingly minor bump against a table leg could, within hours, lead to a swelling in his knee or ankle so grotesque and painful that the boy's screams would echo through the palace corridors. The joint would become hot, tight, and excruciatingly sensitive to the slightest touch. The bleeding was internal, a slow, relentless seepage into the soft tissue and joint spaces that no bandage could staunch. The court physicians would be summoned. They would apply leeches, believing, wrongly, that they could draw out the bad blood. They would prescribe aspirin, which, tragically, thinned the blood and made the bleeding worse. They would immobilize the limb in splints, which often led to the joint fusing in a bent, useless position. The pain was so severe that morphine was a frequent, desperate resort. For days, sometimes weeks, Alexei would lie in a darkened room, his small body racked with agony, his mother a constant weeping vigil at his bedside. It was during one of these terrible crises, when the best doctors of Europe had thrown up their hands in despair, that the Tsarina's desperation took a fateful turn. Her friend, Anna Virubova, a woman of limited intellect but boundless devotion, mentioned a man who was causing a stir in the salons of St. Petersburg. He was a starets, a holy man from Siberia, named Grigory Rasputin. He was said to have the power of prayer, a magnetic presence that could soothe the soul and, some claimed, heal the body. Skeptical, but utterly devoid of hope, Alexandra allowed Rasputin to be brought to the palace in 1905, during one of Alexei's most severe bleeding episodes. The man who entered was unlike any they had ever seen. He was unkempt, with a long, greasy beard, piercing pale eyes, and a smell of cheap soap and old wine. But he possessed an unnerving calm. He did not fuss with medicines or splints. He simply sat by the boy's bed, prayed in a low, hypnotic voice, and spoke softly to the terrified Tsarevich. He told Alexandra, "The little one will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him so much." Miraculously, the bleeding stopped. The crisis passed. To Alexandra, it was not a coincidence. It was a divine intervention. Rasputin, she became convinced, was a man of God, sent to save her son, and by extension, the monarchy itself. She saw, in his rough peasant faith, a purity that the polished doctors of the court lacked. She did not know, nor would she have cared, that Rasputin's miracle likely coincided with the natural, sporadic end of a bleeding episode, or that his advice to keep the doctors away, to stop the painful, counterproductive treatments, was, by sheer accident, the best medical advice the boy ever received. In her mind, a bond was forged in that sick room, a bond of faith and desperation that would soon become the most dangerous secret of all, a secret that would ultimately shatter the throne. The bond between the Tsarina and the Siberian mystic deepened with each perceived miracle. Rasputin, the unwashed peasant, became the most powerful man in Russia, not through political office, but through the back door of the nursery. His influence was the direct result of the Romanovs' deadly secret. Alexandra, increasingly isolated and viewed with suspicion by the Russian court for her German origins, saw in Rasputin her only ally in the battle for her son's life. Her letters to Nicholas, when he was away at military headquarters during the Great War, were filled with Rasputin's advice that soon extended far beyond the boy's sickbed. Our friend says that the new Minister of War is a good man sent by God, she would write. He prays for you, my love, and says not to launch the offensive until the moon is full. Nicholas, a man of weaker will, torn between his duties as He knew that defying Alexandra's wishes, which were now indistinguishable from Rasputin's prophecies, would send her into a state of hysterical despair and, she believed, jeopardize Alexei's fragile health. The Tsar's government became a puppet show, with Rasputin pulling the strings from the shadows. The aristocracy and the Duma, Russia's fledgling parliament, were aghast. They saw a degenerate, a drunkard and womanizer, whose influence over the Tsarina was the subject of salacious rumor and dark suspicion. Whispers circulated that Rasputin was not just a spiritual advisor, but Alexandra's lover, that he was a German spy, that he was the true ruler of Russia. They could not comprehend the simple, terrible truth. His power stemmed from his ability to provide the one thing the Romanovs desperately needed: hope. He was the keeper of their secret, the only one who seemed to hold the key to the curse. This toxic dynamic eroded the very foundation of the monarchy. While Russian soldiers died in their millions on the Eastern Front, the Tsarina, a German by birth, was seen to be taking orders from a depraved mystic. The secret of Alexei's hemophilia, so closely guarded, began to leak. It was an open secret in the diplomatic corps and among the elite. They didn't understand the genetics, but they saw the consequences: a crippled heir and a government controlled by superstition. The prestige of the Romanovs, the divine right of the Tsars, was crumbling into dust and scandal. The final, desperate act to break this sinister influence came from within the palace itself. A group of nobles, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, who was married to the Tsar's own niece, decided that Rasputin must be eliminated for the good of Russia. The plot was as grotesque as the man himself. In December 1916, Yusupov lured Rasputin to his Moika palace under the pretext of meeting his beautiful wife. They served him cakes and wine laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill several men. To their horror, Rasputin showed no effect. Panicking, Yusupov shot him in the back. The starets collapsed, but later revived and stumbled into the courtyard, where his conspirators shot him again and again before finally bundling his seemingly indestructible body into the icy waters of the Malaya Nevka River. When Alexandra received the news, her world shattered. Her son's protector was dead. She saw it not as a political assassination, but as a murder that doomed her child. Her grief was apocalyptic. For Nicholas, it was the final confirmation that he was utterly alone, besieged from all sides. The murder of Rasputin did not save the monarchy. It severed its last, frayed connection to reality. The secret of the bleeding heir had created the circumstances for Rasputin's rise, and his bloody demise now signaled the end of the Romanov dynasty. The curse was claiming its final, most devastating victim, the 300-year-old Russian Empire itself. The Bolsheviks, who stormed the Apadiev house in Yekaterinburg on that bloody July night in 1918, believed they were executing a tyrant and his family. They saw the Romanovs as symbols of a hated, oppressive regime, but they were also, unwittingly, carrying out the final act of a biological tragedy that had begun generations earlier. The bullets and bayonets that ended their lives were merely the brutal, physical conclusion to a story whose true engine was a hidden, microscopic flaw. In the cold, sparsely furnished rooms where the Romanovs spent their final days, the secret of Alexei's condition was still their constant companion. Even as the world collapsed around them, even as they were stripped of their titles and possessions, the curse remained. By then, Alexei, at nearly 14, was a ghost of a boy, A recent hemorrhage in his groin, one of the most dangerous and painful types, had left him largely bedridden and unable to walk without assistance. His father, the former Tsar, had been seen in those final weeks carrying his son in his arms, a poignant and devastating image of paternal love and imperial failure. On the night of the execution, when the command was given, it was Alexei's frailty that created a moment of surreal, horrific confusion. As the firing squad discharged their weapons into Nicholas, Alexandra, their daughters, and servants, Alexei, sitting in a chair, remained alive. The initial volley had missed him, or the bullets had been deflected by the jewels sewn into the family's clothes as a last, desperate attempt to preserve some wealth. He was merely stunned. The assassins then turned their bayonets and rifle butts on the survivors in a frenzy. But Alexei, perhaps protected by his chair or his small crumpled form, still showed signs of life. It was then that the head of the execution squad, Yakov Yurovsky, stepped forward and fired 2 shots directly into the boy's head. The final coup de grace was delivered not just to a political prisoner, but to the living embodiment of a dynastic curse. The hemophilia that had dictated the terms of his life also, in a macabre twist, prolonged his death. The disease that had made him too fragile to rule had, in the end, made him strangely resistant to a quick, clean end. The Romanov line, which had so prized its pure royal blood, was extinguished in abasement, its last male heir succumbing not to his inherited disease, but to the violent political forces that his disease had, in part, unleashed. The secret did not die with them. In the decades that followed, as the Soviet Union sealed the truth about their fate, the mystery of the Romanovs persisted. When the grave was finally discovered and exhumed in the post-Soviet era, forensic scientists turned to genetics to confirm the identities of the remains. The analysis of the bones, believed to be Alexei's, was inconclusive for a time, but the science that finally provided the answers was the same science that had doomed him. Genetic testing confirmed the presence of the specific mutation for Hemophilia B, the royal disease, in the remains of the Empress Alexandra and her son. The secret, locked away in their very DNA, was the final, irrefutable witness. The curse was not a myth or a metaphor. It was a scientific fact, a deadly heirloom passed down through the gilded corridors of power, a tragic testament to the folly of believing that blood, royal or otherwise, could ever be pure. The story of the Romanov curse does not begin in the staterooms of St. Petersburg, but in the bustling, morally rigid court of 19th century Britain. At its center was a tiny woman who cast an impossibly long shadow, Queen Victoria. By the time of her reign, the concept of royal blood had been elevated to a near mystical status. Intermarriage between the crowned heads of Europe was not just tradition. It was a geopolitical strategy, a way to bind nations together in webs of familial obligation. But this strategy relied on a fundamental and fatal ignorance. No one in Victoria's court, or any other, understood the principles of genetics. The work of Gregor Mendel, a contemporary monk quietly breeding peas in an Austrian monastery, was entirely unknown to the palaces of Europe. They operated on a belief system that was part medieval mysticism, part aristocratic pride. They believed that traits, from a noble character to a strong chin, were passed down through the bloodline in a direct and predictable way. The term blue blood itself, sangre azul, originated from the Spanish nobility, who prized their pale, untanned skin through which blue veins showed clearly, a sign they did not work the fields. This was not science. It was vanity. It was into this world that a biological anomaly occurred. Queen Victoria was most likely what geneticists call a spontaneous mutation. Neither of her parents, the Duke and Duchess of Kent, showed any signs of carrying the hemophilia gene. Yet somewhere in the complex process of her own conception, a single tiny error occurred in the genetic code on her X chromosome. This error, a misspelling in the instructions for producing a crucial blood-clotting protein called factor IX, rendered her a carrier. She herself was perfectly healthy. A woman with two X chromosomes needs the defective gene on both to manifest the disease, but she could pass this flawed chromosome onto her children. The first chilling sign appeared in her eighth child, Prince Leopold. As a toddler, he was noted to bruise with terrifying ease. Minor bumps led to swollen, painful joints. Cuts bled for hours. The court physicians were baffled. They diagnosed it as a peculiar constitution, or a weakness of the blood vessels. They subjected the boy to a regimen of leeches and blistering treatments that only worsened his condition. Leopold lived his life in a constant state of caution, a prisoner of his own biology, and would eventually die at age 30 from a brain hemorrhage after a minor fall. He was the first confirmed victim, the proof that the curse was real and active. But the true vector for the disease was not Leopold. It was Victoria's daughters. They, like their mother, appeared perfectly healthy, but they too could be carriers. And as they were married off to secure alliances across Europe, they took the hidden curse with them. Princess Alice married Ludwig IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. Her daughter Alex would one day become Tsarina Alexandra. Princess Beatrice married Prince Henry of Battenberg. Her daughter, Victoria Eugenie, would become Queen of Spain. And Princess Helena married a German prince. Like seeds scattered by a malevolent wind, Victoria's daughters carried the genetic flaw into the heart of continental royalty, setting the stage for a pandemic of suffering that would strike down young princes from Madrid to St. Petersburg. The grandmother of Europe had, entirely unknowingly, become its most prolific purveyor of a deadly secret. The transmission of the curse from the House of Windsor to the House of Romanov was a masterpiece of tragic irony. It was a union born of genuine love, yet it sealed a dynastic fate. The young Tsarevich Nicholas, on a visit to the court of his uncle in Coburg, Germany, fell irrevocably in love with Princess Alex of Hesse. She was a vision of Victorian beauty, slender, with delicate features and intense blue eyes. But behind that serene facade was a young woman haunted by family tragedy. She had witnessed her own mother, Princess Alice, die of diphtheria after nursing her children through the same illness. And she had seen the brief, painful life of her brother, Friedrich, a hemophiliac who had succumbed to a brain hemorrhage after a fall from a window. Alex knew the shadow that stalked the male line of her family. It was a dark, unspoken knowledge that shaped her character, making her serious, deeply religious, and prone to a sense of impending doom. When Nicholas proposed, her initial refusal was rooted in more than just religious scruples about converting to orthodoxy. There was a deep, instinctual fear. She was, in the parlance of the time, a cursed bride. To marry her was to invite the specter of the bleeding disease into one's house. But Nicholas was obstinate in his love. He saw her piety as a virtue and her reserve as noble dignity. He was blind to the genetic warning signs. His own family, the Romanovs, had no history of such a malady, They were a robust, physically strong line. The idea that a seemingly healthy princess could carry a hidden, lethal flaw was beyond the comprehension of 19th century royalty. The strategic benefits of the match were also clear to the Romanov elders. It tied Russia more closely to the powerful British Empire and the intricate web of German principalities. The potential risk, a biological one they could not see or understand, was deemed non-existent. And so, Alex, desperately in love, relented. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy with a fervor that would define her life, taking the name Alexandra Feodorovna. Her wedding to Nicholas in 1894 was a somber affair, overshadowed by the death of his father, Alexander III. The honeymoon period of her reign was brief. The Russian aristocracy never warmed to her. They found her cold, haughty, and too German. They called her the German woman. What they mistook for aloofness was, in fact, a constant, grinding anxiety. Every time she became pregnant, the silent prayer was the same: let it be a girl. Or, if a boy, let him be spared. With the birth of each Grand Duchess, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, there was a sigh of relief mixed with disappointment. The succession was not secure. The pressure on Alexandra mounted. She was seen as failing in her primary duty, to produce a male heir. When she finally delivered a son on August 12, 1904, the joy was initially unrestrained. Cannons boomed across St. Petersburg, church bells pealed, and the nation celebrated. But within the palace, the celebration turned to ashes within weeks. The telltale bleeding from the navel began. The court physicians exchanged grim looks. The secret was out. The curse of Victoria had successfully jumped from the House of Hesse to the House of Romanov. Alexandra's deepest, most private fear had become her reality. And in doing so, it became the most dangerous political secret in all of Russia. The weight of the secret transformed Alexandra Feodorovna. The young woman who had entered Russia with a timid hope now became a fortress, her every action dictated by the need to protect her son. This single-minded focus, while understandable from a mother's perspective, was catastrophic for an empress. She withdrew from the public eye, refusing to participate in the lavish balls and public ceremonies that were the lifeblood of the aristocracy's social calendar. To the people of St. Petersburg, her absence was a sign of snobbery, a cold disregard for Russian tradition. They could not know that she was often trapped in a sick room, holding her son's hand as he whimpered in pain. Her world shrunk to the size of his suffering. This isolation bred paranoia. She began to see enemies everywhere. The court doctors, with their leeches and their painful treatments, were not healers but torturers. The aristocratic ladies who gossiped about her were vipers, jealous of her position and her faith. The politicians in the Duma who questioned the Tsar's autocracy were not reformers but revolutionaries, seeking to undermine the God-given authority that protected her family. In her mind, the entire world was divided into two camps: those who were for her son and those who were against him. There was no middle ground. This mindset made her dangerously susceptible. Her friend, Anna Virubova, a woman of simplistic devotion, became her primary confidant and her window to the outside world. It was through Virubova that she first heard the name Rasputin. The stories of this holy man's powers of prayer and healing arrived at a time when Alexandra was at her most vulnerable. After a particularly harrowing episode where Alexei's leg swelled to twice its size and his fever raged for days, the doctors had all but given up. In a state of utter despair, Alexandra agreed to meet him. Rasputin's genius was not in any mystical power, but in his profound understanding of psychology and his own animal magnetism. He did not approach the sick room with the clinical dread of the physicians. He entered with an unshakable confidence that was, in itself, a powerful medicine. He would pray, his voice a low, resonant drone. He would speak to Alexandra, telling her that her faith was her strength, that God heard her prayers. Most importantly, he would tell her to send the doctors away. Their fussing angers God, he would say. Leave the boy to me and to prayer. The effect was often dramatic. Alexei, calmed by Rasputin's hypnotic presence and the cessation of painful medical interventions, would often relax. The reduction in stress and physical trauma could, in some cases, help the body's own feeble clotting mechanisms to slowly catch up. To Alexandra, it was a miracle, plain and simple. Rasputin had achieved what the greatest doctors of Europe could not. Her gratitude was absolute and unconditional. From that moment on, his influence over her was total. He was not just a holy man. He was the divine instrument of her son's salvation. Any attack on him was an attack on God's will, and by extension, an attack on Alexei himself. The secret of the heir's illness had created an empress who was emotionally crippled, spiritually fanatical, and politically blind, placing the fate of an empire in the hands of a cunning peasant. As Alexei grew from a toddler into a boy, the secret shaped not only his body, but his character. Confined by his condition, he developed a sharp, observant intelligence and a willfulness that often clashed with the prison of his circumstances. He was, by all accounts, a charming and affectionate child, doted upon by his 4 older sisters, who called him baby. But the constant presence of pain and the ever-watchful eyes of his sailors bred in him a deep understanding of his own fragility, and at times, a rebellious spirit. He could not join other children in their games, but he possessed a vivid imagination. He would create elaborate fantasies where he was a brave soldier, leading his toy regiments into battle. His room was filled with lead soldiers, and he would spend hours arranging them in complex formations, a general commanding a world he could control, a stark contrast to the one he inhabited. He developed a keen interest in the mechanics of things, clocks, engines, the simple machinery of everyday life. Perhaps it was a desire to understand a world that operated on predictable, logical principles, unlike his own unpredictable body. His parents, desperate to give him some semblance of a normal life, allowed small, carefully managed risks. They acquired a small donkey for him to ride, as it was less likely to bolt than a pony. Later, they allowed him a small, gentle goat cart. The photographs from this time are poignant. A handsome, fair-haired boy smiling for the camera, often seated or leaning on an adult, his legs sometimes visibly thin and weak compared to his sturdy upper body. The public never saw the images of him in the throes of a bleed, his joints swollen and discolored, his face contorted in agony. These crises were the true rulers of the household. The lively chatter of the 4 sisters would cease, replaced by a fearful hush. The Tsar, a man who prided himself on stoicism, would be visibly shaken, his face pale with helplessness. Alexandra would retreat into a fervent cycle of prayer, her connection to Rasputin becoming her sole lifeline. It was during these times that the mystic's telegrams and letters would arrive, offering reassurance. "The little one will not die," he would write. "Do not let the doctors bother him. Motherly love and prayer are the best medicines." This advice, which flew in the face of all medical science, was followed to the letter. Alexandra would physically block the physicians from attending to her son if Rasputin had counseled against it. On one famous occasion, while the family was at their Polish hunting lodge in Spala in 1912, Alexei suffered one of the worst hemorrhages of his life. A seemingly minor jolt in a carriage ride had caused bleeding in his upper thigh and groin. The internal pressure was so immense it threatened to cut off circulation. His screams were unbearable. The doctors believed he would not survive the night. A desperate telegram was sent to Rasputin in Siberia. His reply came back, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." The next day, the bleeding stopped. For Alexandra, it was the final, unassailable proof of his sainthood. For the rest of the world, it was evidence of a monarchy lost in a fog of superstition, its policies dictated from a sickbed by a peasant mystic. The Spala incident of 1912 was a watershed moment. It was the time the Romanovs' secret nearly broke into the open, and it cemented the toxic dynamic that would lead to revolution. The news that the Tsarevich was at death's door could not be entirely contained. Reports filtered out to the press, though they were heavily censored. The official bulletin spoke of a nervous attack or complications from a chill, but the prolonged nature of the crisis and the presence of so many eminent physicians sparked wild rumors. Within the court, the atmosphere was funereal. Nicholas, torn between his dying son and the demands of his government, was a ghost. Alexandra refused to eat or sleep, her entire being focused on prayer and her correspondence with Rasputin. The grand dukes and ministers who gathered in the halls of the lodge spoke in hushed, terrified tones. They were not just fearing for the boy's life. They were fearing for the future of Russia. The law of succession was clear. If Alexei died, the throne would pass to the Tsar's brother, the feckless and unpopular Grand Duke Michael. The stability of the entire regime hung in the balance. It was in this pressure, cooker of fear and desperation, that Rasputin's telegram arrived. Its contents, whispered from ear to ear, were met with a mixture of awe and profound disgust by the assembled nobility. That the fate of the dynasty should hinge on the words of an uneducated muzhik from Siberia was, to them, the ultimate degradation of the imperial idea. When Alexei, against all medical odds, began to recover, their disgust curdled into a superstitious dread. They could not deny the apparent result, but they saw it not as a miracle, but as evidence of some dark, occult power. For Alexandra, however, Spala was a divine affirmation. Her faith in Rasputin became unshakable, a fundamentalist conviction that brooked no argument. She now believed that he was the only thing standing between her son and the grave. This belief translated directly into political influence. If Rasputin suggested a certain candidate for a ministerial post was pleasing to God, Alexandra would badger Nicholas until the appointment was made. If he muttered that a general was a bad soul, she would demand his dismissal. Nicholas, weary and heartsick, increasingly gave in. "I am not fit to be a czar," he once confided to a minister. He found the minutiae of governance tedious and preferred the simple, structured life of a military officer. The relentless anxiety over his son's health drained him of the energy needed to confront the complex challenges of a modernizing, discontented nation. He began to see Alexandra's fervent, Rasputin-influenced directives as a substitute for his own wavering will. The secret of the heir's illness had effectively created a regency, but a regency run by a hysterical mother and a shadowy mystic, with a passive czar as its reluctant figurehead. The autocracy was now being governed from a child's sickbed, and the entire empire was beginning to feel the fever. As World War I engulfed Europe, the Romanovs' secret began to exert a stranglehold on the very governance of Russia. Nicholas II, against the advice of his ministers, made the fateful decision to assume personal command of the Russian army at the front in 1915. On the surface, it was a move to rally the nation, to embody the Tsar's unity with his soldiers. But beneath the patriotic gesture lay a desperate personal motive. The atmosphere of the Winter Palace, perpetually tense with the fear of Alexei's next hemorrhage, had become unbearable for him. The front, for all its dangers, offered a grim escape from the suffocating anxiety of the sick room. This decision created a power vacuum in the capital, Petrograd. And into this vacuum stepped the Tsarina Alexandra, with Grigory Rasputin as her chief advisor. With Nicholas at military headquarters in Mogilev, hundreds of miles away, their correspondence became the primary channel of government. Her letters, filled with fervent piety and Rasputin's divine counsel, reveal a woman utterly convinced of her own righteous mission. She signed them, "Your poor little weak-willed little wife." But her will was iron, forged in the fire of her son's illness. She saw the war, and indeed all of politics, through the singular lens of protecting Alexei's future throne. Anyone who questioned the autocracy was an enemy. Anyone who spoke against Rasputin was an agent of the devil. Her recommendations for ministerial appointments, which Nicholas rubber-stamped with alarming frequency, were catastrophic. Competent, experienced ministers were dismissed on the whims of the starets, replaced by non-entities whose only qualification was their loyalty to Rasputin or their willingness to kowtow to the Empress. The government became a revolving door of incompetence and corruption. In just 2 years, Russia had 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, and 4 ministers of war. The home front crumbled. Supplies to the army were mismanaged, leading to catastrophic shortages of rifles, ammunition, and even boots for the soldiers. In the cities, inflation skyrocketed and bread lines grew longer. The public, unaware of the Tsarevich's hemophilia, saw only the results. A German Tsarina and a depraved peasant seemingly running the country into the ground while the Tsar was away. The whispers of treason grew into a roar. It was widely believed that Alexandra was a German spy and that Rasputin was her puppet master. They were wrong, but the truth was, in its own way, more damaging. Alexandra was not a traitor. She was a fanatic. Her actions, however destructive, were driven by a desperate belief that she was saving her son's inheritance and upholding the sacred autocracy she believed was God's will. The secret disease, intended to be hidden from the world, was now dictating high-level policy, destabilizing the war effort, and eroding the last vestiges of popular support for the Tsar. The curse was no longer confined to Alexei's joints. It was hemorrhaging into the very arteries of the Russian state. The assassination of Rasputin in December 1916 was not the act of a few disgruntled aristocrats. It was a desperate surgical strike aimed at severing the tumor they believed was killing Russia. The conspirators, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, believed that with the starets gone, the Tsarina would lose her sinister advisor, the Tsar would see reason, and the monarchy could be saved. They could not have been more mistaken. Yusupov, married to the Tsar's niece, had seen the influence of Rasputin firsthand. He and his co-conspirators, including the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin, represented the cream of Russian aristocracy. They were patriots in their own minds, convinced they were performing a necessary, if bloody, act of political hygiene. The plot was hatched with the grim theatrics of a grand tragedy. Yusupov lured Rasputin to his opulent Moika palace with the promise of meeting his beautiful wife, Irina. The basement was set as a trap, laid out with cakes and wine poisoned with enough potassium cyanide to kill several men. The almost supernatural resilience Rasputin displayed that night, surviving the poison, a point-blank gunshot to the chest, and later, more gunshots and a savage beating, only served to cement his demonic legend in the minds of his killers. His final dispatch, thrown into an icy river, was the stuff of nightmares. When the news reached Tsarskoye Selo, the effect was apocalyptic. Alexandra did not weep. She was consumed by a cold, terrifying fury. Her son's protector, the man she believed was a saint sent by God, had been murdered by members of her own family, by the very aristocracy she despised. Her reaction confirmed the conspirators' worst fears about her state of mind. But from her perspective, it was perfectly logical. They had not just killed a man. They had, in her eyes, signed Alexei's death warrant. She saw the hand of the devil in the murder, a direct attack on God's chosen instrument. She demanded the most severe punishment for the killers. But the public reaction was the opposite. The news of Rasputin's death was met with jubilation in Petrograd. People celebrated in the streets, toasting the patriots who had freed Russia from the dark force. Nicholas, caught between his wife's hysterical grief and the public's approval of the murder, proved weak and indecisive. Instead of execution, he exiled Yusupov to his estates and sent Grand Duke Dmitry to the Persian front, a slap on the wrist that satisfied no one. It outraged Alexandra, who saw it as a betrayal, and it emboldened the conspirators and their supporters, who saw the Tsar as hopelessly under his wife's thumb. The assassination, intended to save the autocracy, had instead ripped open the final veil of respectability. It revealed a Tsar who could not control his own family, an empress allied with the occult, and a regime so rotten that its salvation was believed to lie in the murder of a peasant. The fatal crack in the monarchy's foundation had become a chasm. The February Revolution of 1917 did not begin as a movement to abolish the monarchy, but to save it from itself. It was a revolt against incompetence, against the crushing hardships of the war, and against the sinister influence of the Tsarina and her murdered mystic. The secret of Alexei's hemophilia, while not the direct cause, was the poison that had rotted the system from within, making it incapable of responding to the crisis. As bread riots and army mutinies convulsed Petrograd, the Duma pleaded with Nicholas to appoint a government that enjoyed public confidence. But Nicholas, isolated at army headquarters and emotionally battered by years of familial stress, was utterly divorced from reality. His telegrams to the military commanders in the capital ordering them to suppress the unrest with force were an echo from a bygone era. The army, demoralized and sympathetic to the protesters, refused to fire. The system was breaking down, and the Tsar had no tools left to fix it. The authority of the crown, so carefully cultivated over 3 centuries, had evaporated, in large part because it had been squandered on protecting a single, fragile boy. The final crushing blow came on March 2, 1917, aboard the imperial train at Pskov. a delegation from the Duma met with the Tsar and presented him with the stark truth. His abdication was the only way to prevent all-out civil war and chaos. Nicholas, with a stoic calm that stunned those present, agreed. But in a move that shocked the nation, he did not abdicate in favor of his son, the Tsarevich Alexei. The reason he gave to the delegates was that he could not bear to be separated from him. The real reason, the unspoken truth that governed every decision, was Alexei's condition. How could a child who could be disabled by a mere stumble possibly bear the unimaginable burdens of the throne, especially during a revolution and a world war? Instead, Nicholas abdicated for himself and for his son, passing the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. It was an unprecedented, legally dubious act that effectively extinguished the monarchy. Michael, understanding the volatile situation, wisely refused the crown the next day unless it was offered to him by a constituent assembly. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 304 years, was over. The secret was finally and utterly exposed. The need to protect Alexei from the physical strains of rule had directly led to the dynasty's abrupt and total end. The curse had achieved its ultimate victory. It had not just claimed the health of the heir, it had engineered the circumstances for the abdication, ensuring there would be no Romanov left to wear the crown. The family that had hidden its greatest weakness so carefully had been destroyed by it. They were now simply the Romanovs, former royalty, prisoners of the new state, their fate entirely in the hands of the revolution their secret had helped to fuel. The captivity of the Romanov family, first at the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, and later in the remote Siberian town of Tobolsk, was a strange, suspended animation. Stripped of their power and titles, they became the former Tsar and his family. Yet the secret that had defined their reign followed them into exile. In fact, in their newfound claustrophobic intimacy, Alexei's condition became more central to their daily existence than ever before. Freed from the burdens of state, Nicholas seemed almost relieved. He took up a simple routine: reading, chopping wood, clearing snow, and spending long hours with his son. Alexandra, though her health deteriorated, focused her entire being on her family and her faith. But the specter of a hemorrhage was their constant companion. In Tobolsk, during the harsh winter of 1917 to 1918, Alexei, in a rare moment of boyish exuberance, took a ride on a sled down a staircase inside the governor's mansion where they were held. He fell. The familiar, dreaded crisis began. The bleeding was internal, into his groin once more, one of the most dangerous and painful locations. There were no court physicians now, only their faithful family doctor, Eugene Botkin, and their own limited supplies. The Bolshevik guards, who viewed the family with suspicion and contempt, were baffled by the sudden flurry of activity, the hushed tones, the grim faces. They saw a teenage boy being carried everywhere, his face pinched with pain, and assumed he was simply spoiled and lazy. They had no concept of his disease. This incident in Tobolsk highlighted the family's complete vulnerability. They were at the mercy of their captors, who did not understand and would not have cared about the boy's medical needs. Alexandra's diary from this period is filled with agonized entries about Alexei's suffering and her desperate prayers. They were isolated, their fate uncertain, and the one thing that could have elicited a shred of medical sympathy from their jailers, the truth about the Tsarevich's condition, was a secret they still, instinctively, kept close. It was a habit of a lifetime, a protective reflex that had long since lost its purpose. Their final transfer to the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg in the spring of 1918 was a descent into a starker, more brutal form of captivity. The Ural Soviet, which now held them, was far more radical and hostile than their previous guards. The house was fortified, the windows whitewashed shut, cutting them off from the world. It was here, in these cramped, gloomy rooms, that the final act of their tragedy would play out. And it was here that Alexei's frailty reached its peak. A hemorrhage in his leg left him largely bedridden, forcing his father to carry him. As the Bolsheviks debated their fate, the last Tsarevich of Russia lay in pain, a poignant symbol of the physical weakness that had, in so many ways, brought the mighty Romanov dynasty to its knees. The cellar of the Ipatiev house was a stark, square room. Its walls a dull yellow, its floor bare wood. On the night of July 16, 1918, the Romanov family was led there under the pretext of being moved to a safer location due to approaching anti-Bolshevik forces. They descended the stairs, the former Tsar carrying his son Alexei in his arms. The boy, pale and weak from his latest hemorrhage, was dressed in a soldier's tunic and cap. Alexandra, suffering from sciatica, asked for chairs. 2 were brought in for her and her son. The 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, stood behind them, along with Dr. Botkin and their 3 loyal servants. The commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, entered with his execution squad, 11 men, armed with revolvers and a Mauser pistol. He read the sentence of the Ural Soviet in a quick, toneless voice. Nicholas II, stunned, had time only to utter, "What? What?" before the shooting began. The first volley was aimed directly at the Tsar and Dr. Botkin. Nicholas died instantly. The room filled with gun smoke, screams, and the acrid smell of cordite. What followed was not a clean execution, but a chaotic, brutal massacre. The women, having sewn countless diamonds and jewels into their corsets as a safeguard for the future, were surprisingly resilient to the initial bullets. Ricochets and screams filled the air as the killers, their plan devolving into panic, began to bayonet and shoot their victims at point-blank range. Alexei, still sitting in his chair, stunned and unhit in the initial volley, watched the slaughter of his family. When the shooting finally subsided and the killers began to check the bodies, they found the Tsarevich still alive, breathing faintly. One of the executioners stepped forward and fired 2 shots into the boy's head. The final, definitive act of violence was reserved for the heir, the boy whose life had been defined by the fragility of his blood. The disease that had made him a prisoner in life had, in a final, cruel twist, made him a difficult target in death. The Romanov line was extinguished not with a sigh, but with a final, brutal gunshot in a smoky basement. The bodies were then loaded onto a truck, driven to a remote forest mine known as the Four Brothers, and subjected to a gruesome and haphazard disposal. They were stripped, mutilated with grenades, and doused with sulfuric acid to prevent identification before being thrown down a mine shaft. The Bolsheviks were determined to erase them not just from life, but from memory. The secret of Alexei's hemophilia died with him in that cellar, but the physical evidence of his family's existence was treated with a viciousness that spoke to the deep symbolic hatred the new regime held for the old order. The curse had run its course, ending in a final, bloody spasm of violence. For decades, the fate of the Romanovs was one of the 20th century's greatest mysteries. The official Soviet line was that only Nicholas II had been executed. The rest of the family, they claimed, had been moved to a safe location. This lie fostered decades of speculation, myths, and a parade of imposters claiming to be the surviving Grand Duchess Anastasia, or the Tsarevich Alexei. The truth was buried, first in a secret grave, and then under layers of state-sponsored disinformation. The Romanovs had become ghosts, their story a blank slate for fantasy and conspiracy. The secret, however, was not gone. It was waiting in the earth. In 1979, a trio of amateur Soviet historians, driven by a fascination that defied official dogma, secretly located the burial site in the Koptyaki forest. They exhumed a few of the bones, confirmed their grim suspicions, and, fearing discovery by the KGB, reburied them. It was not until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the grave was officially excavated. The world watched as forensic scientists from Russia and the West began the grim task of identification. The remains were fragmented, burned, and damaged by acid. Using dental records and photographic superimposition, they began to piece together the puzzle. But the most compelling evidence came from the science of genetics. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and a grandnephew of the Tsarina Alexandra, provided a blood sample. His mitochondrial DNA was a perfect match to the bones identified as Alexandra and her daughters, but a mystery remained. The grave contained only 9 skeletons. 2 were missing: Alexei and one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia. This fueled the survival myths for years. It wasn't until 2007 that a second, smaller grave was discovered a short distance from the first. Here, buried in a separate pit, were the fragmented, charred remains of a young boy and a young woman. The genetic testing was conclusive. The boy's bones showed a perfect match to the Romanov paternal line. And, critically, his DNA told the final, silent chapter of the story. Analysis of the remains revealed a specific mutation on the X chromosome, the telltale signature of Hemophilia B. The science of genetics, which did not exist to save him, had returned 8 decades later to confirm the cause of his suffering. The Romanovs' most closely guarded secret was no longer a secret. It was a scientific fact, etched into the very DNA of the last Tsarevich. The identification of Alexei's remains and the genetic confirmation of his hemophilia closed a historical loop, providing a definitive, scientific epilogue to a century of mystery. But it also forced a profound and unsettling reassessment of the entire Romanov narrative. This was no longer just a political story of revolution and regicide. It was a biomedical tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. The downfall of the 300-year dynasty could now be traced in a direct and unbroken line to a single microscopic error in a genetic sequence. The what-if questions are haunting. What if the royal houses of Europe had understood genetics? What if Nicholas II had married a princess from a bloodline untouched by Victoria's curse? The heir to the Russian throne would have been a healthy, robust boy, capable of riding, of playing, of projecting the strength required of a future autocrat. The Tsarina Alexandra would not have been driven to the depths of religious mania and isolation. The doorway through which Rasputin entered history and politics would never have opened. Without Rasputin's corrosive influence, the credibility of the Tsar and Tsarina might not have collapsed so completely. The government might have retained a semblance of competence and public trust, potentially weathering the storm of World War I without revolution. Of course, The Romanov autocracy was plagued by deeper systemic issues: social inequality, industrial unrest, political repression. It may have fallen regardless, but the secret illness of the Tsarevich acted as a devastating accelerant, pouring gasoline on the smoldering embers of discontent. It crippled the ruling family at its core, distorting their judgment, isolating them from reality, and making them appear not just incompetent, but morally and spiritually bankrupt in the eyes of their people. The story of the Romanov hemophilia is the ultimate cautionary tale about the dangers of privilege divorced from knowledge, and of tradition blinding its adherents to reality. The European nobility's obsession with pure blood was a biological fallacy of the highest order. In their quest to maintain exclusivity, they had created a genetic prison, concentrating deadly traits instead of diluting them. They worshipped their bloodlines while remaining utterly ignorant of what truly flowed within them. The Romanovs were the most spectacular victims of this ignorance, their dynasty ultimately sacrificed on the altar of their own pride. The curse was not a supernatural vengeance. It was the inevitable result of a closed system turning in on itself, a deadly secret woven into the double helix, passed down from a grandmother to a grandson, from a queen to a czar, with consequences that would forever alter the course of history. The echoes of the Romanov curse did not fade with the gunshots in the Ipatiev house. The genetic legacy of Queen Victoria continued its silent, devastating march through the royal houses of Europe, a grim reminder that biology respects no borders and shows no deference to crowns. While the Romanovs suffered the most politically catastrophic consequences, other families bore the same painful burden. In Spain, Queen Victoria Eugenie, another of Victoria's granddaughters, carried the gene into the House of Bourbon upon her marriage to King Alfonso III. The curse announced itself on their wedding day in 1906. As the royal procession returned to the palace, an anarchist threw a bomb hidden in a bouquet of flowers at the carriage. The explosion was horrific, killing dozens of spectators and guards. The new queen, splattered with blood, was initially thought to be wounded, but the blood was not her own. It was a grim portent. Two of her sons, Alfonso and Gonzalo, were born hemophiliacs. Their childhoods were a mirror of Alexei's, a constant cycle of bleeds, pain, and desperate medical interventions. The Spanish court, like the Russian, became a place of whispered anxieties and guarded secrets. The queen blamed for introducing a foreign disease into the royal line. Both princes died young from complications of their condition, their lives cut short by the same invisible enemy that had stalked the Romanov heir. The German royal families, so often the source of brides for the Romanovs, were also deeply affected. Victoria's daughter, Princess Alice, passed the gene to her daughter, Irene, who married her first cousin, Prince Henry of Prussia. Irene, in turn, passed it to two of her sons, Waldemar and Henry. Prince Henry of Prussia died at the age of 4 after a minor fall, a tragedy that echoed the death of Alex's brother decades earlier. The pattern was relentless, a transnational epidemic of suffering confined to the most gilded of nurseries. These parallel tragedies across Europe provide the final chilling context for the Romanov story. They were not a unique cursed family, but the most prominent node in a continent-wide web of genetic misfortune. The very practice that was meant to secure peace and power, intermarriage between a small, closed group of families, had become a vehicle for a shared biological doom. The royal disease was the ultimate proof of their interconnectedness, a bond of blood far more profound and inescapable than any treaty or alliance. As scientists today study the Romanov DNA, they are not just solving a historical mystery. They are mapping the physical footprint of this vast, tragic consanguinity, revealing how the pride of lineage and the hunger for power wrote a deadly code into the very bodies of its heirs. The final lingering question is one of legacy. What does the story of the Romanov hemophilia leave behind, beyond the grim facts of history and genetics? It stands as an eternal monument to the law of unintended consequences, a stark lesson in how the actions taken to preserve a system can, with the cruel clarity of hindsight, be the very actions that ensure its destruction. The Romanovs, and the European aristocracy as a whole, were trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, its bars forged from their own unwavering belief in the supremacy of their blood. For centuries, they had operated on a simple, self-serving logic. Power was legitimized by divinity and heritage was preserved by purity of blood. This was not merely snobbery. It was a core tenet of their political theology. To marry outside the narrow pool of royalty was to dilute this sacred essence, to risk contaminating the divine right to rule with the ordinary. They could not see that this obsessive inbreeding was not concentrating power, but concentrating risk. They were playing a reckless genetic lottery, and for generations, they had been lucky. But with Queen Victoria, their luck ran out. The mutation she carried was the jackpot of ruin, and the Romanovs, through a marriage of love and strategy, drew the winning ticket. The true tragedy lies in the complete disconnect between cause and effect. Alexandra Feodorovna, praying desperately by her son's bedside, never understood that the source of her agony was the very principle that had placed her on that throne. She saw Rasputin as a godsend, never comprehending that he was a symptom of the disease, not its cure. Nicholas II, signing abdication papers to protect his son from the strains of power, never realized that the need for that protection was the original sin that had made abdication inevitable. They were like characters in a Greek tragedy, moving inexorably towards a fate they themselves had set in motion, blind to the threads they were pulling. Today, the science of genetics has lifted this veil of ignorance. Modern royalty, learning from the devastating lessons of the past, has largely abandoned the practice of close intermarriage. The blue blood has been mingled with that of commoners, strengthening the gene pool and ensuring the health of future heirs. The story of the Romanov hemophilia thus marks a pivotal point in history. The moment when ancient tradition collided with biological reality, and reality won. It is a story that whispers a timeless warning, that the greatest threats often come not from external enemies, but from the hidden flaws we cherish and the secrets we keep, even from ourselves.